Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and we're thrilled to welcome you to this week's live Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the global data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem. And this show is for you regardless of what your company does in the data center industry. Perhaps you're part of a data center operator, like in co-location, hyperscale, edge, modular, wholesale data center developer, or maybe your company does something related to data center technology or data center facilities somewhere in the ecosystem. Or maybe you're responsible for building or marketing or running or the construction, real estate, or an investment part, all of the capital that comes into fueling this amazing period of growth in and around the global data center ecosystem. Or maybe your company is involved in some kind of outsourced sales and marketing capacity within the global data center ecosystem. Either way, regardless of what your company's role is in and around data centers, you're for sure to learn something if you work on some facet of go-to-market. Maybe you work in sales, like as an account executive or sales development or business development rep, or post-sales as like an account manager or client success. Or maybe you do something in marketing, like event marketing, field marketing, social media, content, digital marketing, product marketing. Or speaking of product, maybe you work as a product manager or in some facet of innovation within your company. And can't forget about all the direct versus indirect. Maybe your company has an indirect playbook in addition to your direct playbook, and you work in some facet of channel partnerships. Or maybe you are the executive sponsor, the would-be superhero who's responsible, whose job it is to go out into the marketplace and attract the best and brightest to your company, to get the right people sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at just the right speed, playing their musical instruments at the exact volume, at the exact tempo, at just the right time, from the correct sheet music that makes the most sense for your company. But either way, if you're looking to level up on your sales, marketing, go-to-market strategy, and you want to be able to capitalize on this amazing period of growth in and around the data center ecosystem, you are for sure in the right place. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? First up, we're going to talk about how co-location sales reps can build trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals. After that, we'll turn our attention to how data center marketers get the buy-in needed to lead their company's growth. Next, we'll turn our attention to how an edge data center provider generates consistent new opportunities. That'll put us right at the halfway point for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and then we'll take a real quick break from a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's show, we'll dive into hyperscale operators, and in particular, how a hyperscale data center operator can build a quality pipeline. Following that, we'll get into how data center operators can stand out from the competition. Big challenge in a lot of very mature markets. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, we'll talk about how to improve data center brand recognition. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you and your team are currently facing, and you'd like us to consider addressing it in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on. And we'll be sure to add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how does a co-location sales rep build trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals? That's a fantastic question, because as time goes on As we move from cloud and SaaS and infrastructure as a service and mobile and generative AI, well, generative AI is still relatively new, but most of these other technologies are fairly mature in their categories. And in a lot of ways, the IT professionals, the engineers, the construction, the developers, who that you sell to, has gotten to the point where trust is definitely a big issue. And what do I mean by that? Well, 10 years ago, we were in a place where people did a lot of research before they got to you, before they scheduled a meeting with someone from your sales team. 10 years ago, it was pretty common that they would use their mobile devices and search engines and social media, and they'd watch some webinars and they'd listen to some podcasts, they'd look at some online reviews, and they'd get about roughly halfway there. At the time, 56% of a typical journey was over before vendor contact or sales contact. So that wasn't too bad. If you did everything right, you were locked out for the first 56% of their research and decision making, but at least you were in there for the final 44%. If you like sports analogies, well, imagine that you couldn't get into the stadium, you couldn't get into the arena till a little past halfway, till halftime, but you were welcomed in with open arms in the beginning of the third quarter. So you still had some time to make up from lost ground. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, 10 years has really, really accelerated digital transformation. And as a result, throughout the data center ecosystem, we now find that most of your prospects and clients have very different behaviors, very different preferences than they had as recently as 10 years ago. And some of that has to do with AI, has to do with chat apps and large language models and self-serve. But in general, like 10 years of digital transformation, tens of millions of people that got used to working from home and hybrid work arrangements at the beginning of the 2020s, millions of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z, a lot more millennials in decision-making roles. And we're now in the place where we're that 56%, 57% number that I talked about 10 years ago, back when CEB, the corporate executive board that's now part of Gartner, did that seminal research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions. Yeah, it was a little more than halfway over, but you still got to spend almost half of the sales cycle, almost half of their journey with your prospects and clients. That, unfortunately, is now very much a nostalgic memory in the rearview mirror. All of these changes over the last 10 years has got us to the point now, most of your prospects and clients get like to 83% of the way through their research and decision-making process. They're almost ready to buy before you get to meet them. What are they doing before that? Well, all of the other things that they've been doing for 10, 15, 20 years before that. They were looking up tons of questions on search engines, on their mobile devices, on social media. They were watching all the YouTube videos, listening to all the podcasts, attending all the webinars, reading all the online reviews. And then in late 2022, early 2023, artificial intelligence and machine learning jumped into the mainstream in a big time way when OpenAI took ChatGPT out of beta. And since then, ChatGPT and Copilot and Perplexity and Gemini and Claude, these applications on both our mobile phone and the web versions that we use on our desktops and laptops have gotten so pervasive that it's dramatically accelerated the desire for self-service. So what that means is if you work as a sales professional now, if you work as like an account manager, an account executive, sales development, or a marketer, or a founder, entrepreneur, like it's gotten to the point now where your insights and advice about your category need to be so good that it needs to be better than what your prospects and clients can get from having a conversation about that topic with ChatGPT or one of ChatGPT's competitor apps. That's crazy, right? It's gotten to the point where if you thought people were addicted to their smartphones before that, we're like the next level now, where people are having such deep relationships with the LLM app, the large language model app, the generative AI app on their phone, that people are starting to half jokingly, half seriously say that like they know friends and family members that are in a relationship with Copilot or Gemini or ChatGPT. Like the kind of relationship where people are literally half jokingly, half seriously predicting that within the next 10 years, you're going to start to see, I don't know if it's 10 years, but within a generation, you're going to start to see your kids, your grandkids marry an AI spouse. Like, what the heck? Seriously, like the apps are getting so good and the robotics are getting it so good at being able to mirror what humans want from these conversations. This is beyond super intelligence. This is beyond artificial general intelligence. But in the short term, what everyone in a commercial capacity in the data center industry should be thinking about is how can you position yourself so that your knowledge, your expertise, your education is so incredibly valuable for a small sliver of the marketplace that it's more valuable than what your prospects and clients can get from having that exact same conversation with ChatGPT. And boy, does that raise the stakes. And it changes the nature of who you hire, regardless of whether you're a data center operator or a technology or facilities companies or construction, real estate, or investor, or some kind of outsourced sales and marketing in the ecosystem. It really does change the nature of who you hire, because now what we're starting to see is a lot more revenue teams, a lot more leadership teams are trying to hire people in sales client-facing roles that have very similar backgrounds to their ideal clients, to their prioritized buyer personas. And they're changing the nature of how territories and accounts are signed so that, again, it mirrors a really, really tight relationship between the account executive, the account manager, and the prospect's company that they work for and the job roles that they're involved in. So what does this mean from a practical standpoint? Let's say you were someone that worked as an IT manager in healthcare for most of your career, like you worked in big hospital systems or for big healthcare insurance companies or health tech software. You at some point could, especially if you had direct responsibility over your own in-house data centers and the relationships that you had with cloud service providers and managed service providers and co-location operators, at some point you would be incredibly valuable to join a co-location operator in a business development, an account executive, an account management, or product management capacity, because you have insane amounts of instincts and relationships and understanding of what a CTO or CIO is looking for, what an IT executive is looking for in healthcare. So it used to be, as recently as 10 years ago, that a chief revenue officer or chief commercial officer, when it came time to deciding how to divvy up account lists, how to divvy up teams, the first cut usually was geographic, especially for like a co-location operator. The second cut usually was by account size. So you'd have reps that sold to small business versus mid-market versus enterprise. Much more at stake, much more complex sales process, a lot more decision makers, a lot stronger unit economics, but again, a longer sales cycle and a lot more at stake. So you divide up geographically, you divide up by the size of the account you were selling into. And then for generations, we've divvied up by life cycle stage, meaning that different people talk to early stage leads versus late stage leads. That was the difference between like an account executive versus a sales development or business development rep. That really gained steam in the early 2000s when the playbook around SaaS started to pick up momentum. And then there's the whole post-purchase, account managers, client success managers. Now we see an additional segmentation of talent, of expertise. We see a lot of companies that are choosing to hire experts and segment out the target accounts by industry. Manufacturing accounts, telecommunications accounts, healthcare accounts, financial services, state, local education, K-12, higher education, selling to data center operators, infrastructure, hyperscalers. There's a lot of different ways to slice and dice to optimize your talent recruitment and their efficiency, but it is an unmistakable trend that we see. And all of this is to design your team in such a way that you have a strong differentiation, strong competitive advantage when it comes to building trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals. So what does a sales professional, what does an account executive, an SDR, an account manager do in a world where your prospects and clients really don't want to hang out with you anymore? They just simply don't. They strongly prefer self-service. They don't need anyone to read the slides to them or read the web page to them. The explainer videos or the feature in the web browsers now that says read aloud has pretty much taken care of all of that. So how do you provide so much expertise that they want to spend time with you without resorting to a bribe? I see, by the way, I'm not going to get up on the soapbox on this for more than a few moments, but I see a lot of really, really confused people in this industry that are so desperate to reclaim that attention that they're resorting to bribes. Now, these may not be the kind of bribes that rise to the level of like corruption or malfeasance or governance alarms, but like, what do you call when you invite someone to a sporting event where the tickets are hundreds of dollars or hundreds of pounds and there's no education and trust building going on there and it's just a social event? What do you call that when you invite them to a golf tournament? Again, no education and trust building. What do you call it when it's a party where amazing music, they had a fantastic time, but they have no idea who they actually talk to there. And all they know is they have a hangover and they're hoarse in the morning. I don't know who are the CFOs and the boards who keep signing off on this nonsense, but it's for sure not educating and building trust. At a typical global data center conference or a national data center conference, roughly 3% of the people that are there are educating and building trust. They're the speakers. So a conference, let's say, that has 2,500 attendees, there's 75 speakers, 75 over 2,500 attendees, 3% are there for sure to educate and build trust. And in a perfect world, they actually earned their way in under editorial merits as opposed to doing pay to play. That's another minor problem or major problem, depending on how you look at the business ethics of educating and building trust in this ecosystem. And most of those speakers will typically bring along a couple of coworkers, like an average of 2 coworkers along with them. So there's roughly 225, 250 people out of the 2,500 at that conference who are either speaking and educating and building trust or in a position to directly monetize that education and trust building that's going on. Roughly another 10% of the people that are there at the conference are there to run the booths. What they're doing is they're hoping to coast on the fumes and the goodwill that was built up by the speakers to get people in a good enough mood that they don't need a big enough bribe to stop by your booth and engage in chat and allow you to do a sliver of educating and building trust. And when I say a sliver, the speakers get to educate and build trust for 45 minutes, or at least 20 minutes, or in some cases, significantly more than 45 minutes, nonstop educating and building trust. So for people that are in the events marketing business or run like webinars or do YouTube, like we always talk about like average session time. So their average session time, their metrics, their KPIs on how much attention that they've earned from attendees at that conference is like off the charts relative to someone stopping by your booth and getting their badge scanned and chatting for 45 seconds. You can't really do much education and trust building. And then the other 80% of the people that are there that aren't running the booths, that aren't running the stands, and that aren't speaking at the conference, the other 80% are the reason the conference exists in the first place. If there's no other 80%, if there's no captive audience, there's no sponsors or exhibitors that are going to spend a small fortune to be there, and there's no speakers that are going to speak for free, waive a speaking fee, travel at great expense and great effort, in some cases even paying to speak to get in front of the audience. So that 80% captive audience essentially is the product. A lot are confused. They think they're going there to learn. I guess they're learning, but the reality is webinars, podcasts, there's so many ways to learn and to keep your skills sharp about what's going on in the industry. Is that really the only way to learn? Networking with peers. It used to be 10 years ago that there was a little bit of disagreement about how critical of a role LinkedIn played in the data center ecosystem. And you get people that came along and say, I don't like social media. That's not for me. That's for the kids, whatever. I can tell you over the past 10 years, without a doubt, the more than 1 billion members on LinkedIn, a very, very high percentage are active monthly, weekly, daily, multiple times a daily users on LinkedIn as a professional network. And it even crosses generations. And this is where the excuse making really went out the window in the last couple of years, because there's not that many baby boomers that still work actively full-time in the data center industry. A lot more work as consultants and advisors and board members at this stage, but there's still, because of the decades of institutional knowledge that they have. They're very much in demand to speak at these events. And if you see someone at that stage in their career speak at an event and you post something on LinkedIn and you mention that person, hey, great talk about the unit economics of liquid cooling. I really enjoyed the point that you made on slide 3 about how Asia Pacific is outpacing the Americas or whatever it is. You'd be shocked within minutes of them coming off stage. They're hitting the like button and they're commenting back. So anyone that thinks that there's a significant amount of data center ecosystem that is fiercely resisting digital didn't witness what happened in the early 2020s. The digital transformation across generations is now completely off the charts. So in terms of networking with peers, LinkedIn is the 7/24/365 conference that never shuts down. And the other excuse, the other rationale that people usually make for over-investing and attending 50 conferences a year or whatever is showing up on your expense report is I want to see what new vendors have to offer. That's an interesting one too, because what that tells us is, so you don't realize that every time they have something new to offer, that they're posting that on their LinkedIn company page, or that they're sending an email out to everyone that's on their email mailing list, or posting YouTube videos about it, or spending a small fortune for PR firms to try to amplify that throughout all the trade publications in the ecosystem. You missed all of that. So like all of these excuses, what a lot of it boils down to is I think there's some people that have done a masterful job of convincing their executives that conferences are so mandatory in this ecosystem that if they don't go, that everything's going to fall completely on the floor. I have another way of looking at it. I look at, remember there was a talk show host 10, 20 years ago, iconic, Oprah Winfrey. And whenever she would have a guest on, she would have a guest that would do something amazingly generous with all of the audience members. If it was someone who was the author of a best-selling book, when the author came out on stage and they gave a talk and they said, and look under your chair and you're getting the book and you're getting the book and you're getting the book. If it was someone that was from a car company and you're getting a car and you're getting a car, and everyone gets a car, everyone gets a book, everyone gets a gift card, what it is. So in this particular case, I think there's a lot of people in the data center industry that have figured out a way to get their employer to send everyone to President's Club, regardless of whether they're in that upper echelon of performers that have actually earned President's Club. And can't blame them. It's a lot of fun to get an employer to send you to Hawaii or Bali or Cannes or some exotic destination that you wouldn't necessarily go to yourself or with your family, but hey, your employer's paying for it, and drop into a couple sessions a day. And it's like two extremes. There's people that go to conferences that are working 18 hours a day and they need like a week to sleep when they get back to recover. And then there's the other that are just kind of there as spectators and passively taking it in a little bit. I think there's a good 10 or 20% of the people that go to conferences that are there on their employer's dime to look for the next job. So there's a lot of weird things that question, like if we're really educating and building trust, if that's what the if that's what this is all about, educating and building trust, if conferences are really doing their job. So coming back to the original question here, like building trust and credibility for skeptical IT professionals. I've already had a number of people appear on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that I host, calling onto the mat how well the conferences do at attracting IT professionals that want to spend time with co-location operators. In most cases, most of the conferences are vendors selling to vendors. In other words, co-location companies selling to other co-location companies, selling to power and cooling companies, selling to rack and enclosure companies. So like the question is, when you're signing on, whether it's attending, exhibiting, or speaking, do your basic due diligence. Get their media kit from this year, from last year, and look and see, is there a good match with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas as compared to theirs? If there's not, we call that a looking for a needle in the haystack conference, where even if you manage to get to the top 3% and are speaking and educating and building trust, it doesn't do you much good if 95% of the people attending the conference are not your ideal client profile, meaning they're from the wrong geographic region, their companies are too small, their companies are too big, it's the wrong industries. kind of what I would call ICP, ideal client profile malpractice. Make sure you do the basic diligence on that if you're investing heavily on that. But if you're looking to build trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals who are more cynical, more sales allergic than they've ever been in the history of the IT industry, there's a really, really straightforward playbook that I would encourage you to invest in. Educating and building trust. And what does that look like from a tactical standpoint? The good part from going to your CFO, going to your board, going to your boss and trying to get budget for all of this is when you decide that instead of investing all of your budget in huge conferences where there's like an 80 or 90% loss factor and you're begging to get a few minutes of time, what if the entire room was filled with people that matched up with your ideal client profile, that were from your target accounts? And what if instead of having to settle for 45 seconds of their attention, you had 45 minutes of their attention? And what if the positioning of this was so valuable from their standpoint that they were bringing their coworkers along with them? So you got to meet multiple members of the decision committee and eventually even got to meet their boss. That's the playbook that most co-location sales reps should be doubling and tripling down on going forward. And what this looks like from a tactical standpoint, you need extreme clarity on your ideal client profile, knowing exactly where your prospects are located, how big or small their companies are, and how big they need to be is usually getting real about your minimum level of co-location that they can buy from you. Is it a cabinet? Is it 5 cabinets? Whatever it is, you know that price point and how big does that company need to be to afford that price point? And conversely, depending on how competitive your offering is for mid-market and enterprise clients, is there a point where the client is so big that your likelihood of being able to close and retain that client is like extraordinarily small? So this is where understanding your sweet spot, understanding the biggest part of your bell curve where you should be concentrating most of your efforts is incredibly important. And especially for co-location, the industry, the vertical is pretty important as well, because in most parts of the world, there are regulated industries that require certain kinds of accreditations, compliance, certifications, SOC, HIPAA, PCI, whatever it is that's relevant for you and your particular geographic market is going to either qualify or disqualify your company from being able to do business with wide segments of the market that are typically segmented up by industry, by vertical, by segments. So getting that ICP, getting that ideal client profile really dialed in allows you to build an effective target account list of a couple. For most co-location companies in most metro markets, it's usually a couple hundred target accounts. If you were selling huge hyperscalers, it would be a few dozen accounts. If you're in a really, really big metro area and you have a little bit of something for everyone, you may even have thousands of companies on the target account list. Usually it's a couple hundred. And what I want you to do is once you understand those couple hundred companies, figure out who the first and second most important kind of stakeholder is in those companies. Who is the biggest economic impact and the second biggest economic impact on their relationship with your company? The one with the biggest economic impact we'll call your primary buyer persona. The one with the second biggest impact we'll call your secondary buyer persona. There may even be, depending on how expansive your addressable market is, how big your company is, how big their company is, you may even end up having 3 or 4 or 5 different personas, different ways that you segment up your leads and clients. And for most co-location operators, they usually have a channel partner buyer persona as well. And it's just a matter of whether that ends up being a second or third or fourth, like a managed service provider, a value-added reseller, an integrator, or something like that. Then for each of those segments, it's critical to understand what's going on in that person's world. What are their biggest goals that they're working on individually, as a team, and as a company? In their own words. We need to get those goals in their own words. And what are they struggling with the most? What's driving them nuts? What's screwing with their work-life balance? What's causing their family and friends that they're on vacation with to be fuming that they can't truly unplug? What's causing them to be stressed out, losing sleep, maybe even mental health problems? A host of challenges that are totally, completely driving them nuts. And we need to know those challenges in their own words. 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges for each of these segments in their own words. And once we know those, we'll end up with 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind for that kind of stakeholder in that kind of company. And those 10 or 12 topics are going to be the 10 or 12 topics that I want you to cover in your 10 or 12 monthly events that you're going to hold once a month for the next 10 or 12 months. For co-location operators, because server hugging is still alive and well, there's a really good chance that most of the target accounts and most of the prioritized buyer personas that are front and center on your front burner will likely be from companies that are within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your location, meaning that that person could easily attend an educational event in your facility once a month if the content, if the educational experience was that good. Now, there's always going to be 10 or 20% of co-location addressable market that's long distance, meaning they're not going to server hug. They can't get to your facility easily. They may be hours or a plane ride or two away from being able to get there. And that needs a long distance playbook. That's okay as well. The key thing is once we understand those 10 or 12 topics once a month for the next 10 or 12 months, that's your monthly breakfast seminar. That's your monthly lunch and learn series. That's your monthly business after hours symposia. That's your monthly webinar series. And obviously, if they are long distance, it's a webinar, virtual. If they're local, you're trying to get them to attend in person. Now, with all of these, record those. There's always going to, especially for free events, there's always going to be a difference between the number of people that registered and actually attended. And there's always, as long as you do a good job, there's always going to be someone that comes up to you afterwards and said, my boss really needed to be here. My network operations person really needed to be here. Our cybersecurity expert, our CISO really needed to be here. Can I get the slides? Can I get the recording? Yeah, of course. So it's for them. And then also gives you fantastic content to repurpose a dozen different ways into shorter videos, really short vertical videos, documents, carousels, infographics, blogs, email newsletters, social posts, the whole 9 yards, because there will be people that you attract that loved a 1 minute and 40-second segment, a 100-second segment out of the 45-minute talk that won't necessarily watch the 45-minute talk until they're hooked on what they learned in that first minute and a half or so, and vice versa. So yes, by all means, record. So the goal with building trust and credibility is going forward, account executives, account managers, business developers, sales developers, marketers should look a lot less like their traditional job titles and should look a lot more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. And when you do that well, and the landing page to register for that event conveys that big goal, that big challenge in their exact words, and puts out there some bullet points and an outline of how you're going to help them achieve that in that session, that event that they attend, and drops in a speaker bio that they're like, yeah, I really would like to learn about that from that particular person. And if you have internal speakers who can do this, by all means, stack the decks with your events using internal speakers. If those internal speakers are not cooperating with you, you have a C-level alignment problem. This is why it's so critical. If you're looking to change the culture of your company and get the heck out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box, for small and mid-sized companies, you absolutely positively need your CEO to be your internal champion. For mid-sized companies, it's usually a chief commercial officer, chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, something like that. And for enterprise companies, it's usually a division VP or division managing partner or managing director or something like that. But yeah, these are big culture changes for a lot of companies. Now, I'm not telling you to immediately go into your email signature and your LinkedIn profile and your business cards and come up with a better synonym from your traditional sales job title that, frankly, for sales allergic, skeptical IT professionals is sending them running for the hills. I'm not telling you to immediately change the job title from AE or SDR or AM or something like that. But what I am telling you is your prospects and clients don't want to hang out with you anymore. They just don't. They strongly, strongly prefer self-service. You may delude yourself into thinking they want to hang out with you if you're bribing them. Sure, everyone would love to go to the Super Bowl or go to the World Series or go to a really fancy golf club, or we take it out and wine and dine to a fancy dinner. Is that really education and trust building? I don't know, maybe you can talk yourself into believing it is, but I don't see how that's getting you introduced to multiple members on the decision committee. I don't see how that could possibly shape their belief system by you having opportunity to introduce them to best practices when they attend. So month number one, person number one from one of your target accounts is one of the 20 people that's sitting in your conference room. So again, the cool part with all this is it costs virtually nothing to run. Got a conference room, got a classroom, great. Seats 15 or 20 people, fantastic. Got a foyer that can be repurposed for that once a month, even better. With all of this, you don't need big numbers. This industry is completely messing with people's heads, trying to convince them that vanity metrics matter, that you need to be in front of hundreds or thousands of people. No. If there's 100 target accounts that you're going after, and there's roughly 8 people that are on each of those teams in those 100 accounts, so roughly there's 800 people that you'd love to get in front of over the next 12 months. If you can get 200 of those people out of those 800, representing, I don't know, 30 to 50% of your target accounts, attending multiple in-person events, multiple webinars where you're educating and building trust with them about a big goal that they've expressed in their own words, a big challenge that they've articulated in their own words, you will start to move the needle. You will start to introduce them to your best practices, your methodology. You will dramatically impact how they evaluate the competitive options that are in front of them. And speaking of competitive options, this not only gets you on the short list and keeps you on the short list, but when you do a fantastic job with this, it starts to knock the other bozos off of the short list. Why? Because they're spending so much time learning from your client-facing team members and being educated. And as a byproduct of education, building up the know, like, and trust, that there's not a big amount of time or a big amount of reason for them to go learn elsewhere. So again, the mindset change, the cultural change with all of this to get out of the vendor box is to recognize that they don't want to spend time with you anymore. Search, social, videos, webinars, podcasts, and for sure, the generative AI apps, the ones that are filling up all the data centers, they are winning, and in many cases have already won those battles. Your best option as a co-location sales professional is to recognize that the IT buyers that you want to sell to still need to learn. They still need learning and development, and they still need professional development. And to the extent that you can become a regular integral part of their learning and development and professional development process by either you being the one who's the teacher, the instructor, the consultant, or curating and hosting and moderating other internal subject matter experts from your team that are the featured speakers at these small, intimate events, game-changing impact. And if you exhaust your available internal speakers, not a big problem either. You have contractors you work with, right? You have channel partners you work with, you have vendors you work with. They can provide speakers. What about your clients? Some of them would love to be on a panel where 2, 3, 4 of them are being interviewed by you about a half a dozen different topics that are top of mind for the IT executive at a mid-market manufacturing company in your region. What's in it for them? They're learning from their peers. What's in it for you? They're seeing you as the expert, the trusted advisor. This is how you get skeptical IT professionals to begin to trust you, because they're learning about valuable best practices, about how others in the same job function or similar job function in similar companies in this geographic region of roughly this company size are addressing how they're achieving these big goals that are directly and indirectly related to co-location and digital infrastructure, and addressing some of the biggest nagging challenges and things that are driving them nuts that's directly related to co-location and digital infrastructure. So when it comes to how co-location sales reps can build trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals, if your company leadership is not on board with this, I want you to take the recording from this data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show and watch this segment with them. Because there's a really good chance that if they're completely unaware that this is going on, that your company is wasting somewhere between hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars a year in budget or your local currency equivalent on, frankly, a circus that stopped working 4, 5, 6 years ago. And that's not to say that there aren't some events and conferences that are still worth doing. If there's a really good match with their audience and demographics and your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas, at least the right people are there. The next hurdle with all of that is how you get into the top 3%. So you're the one that's educating and building trust at that particular event. Without those two building blocks in place, I would question what the heck you're doing. So at the absolute minimum, figure out what's the bottom 20% of the events that you're currently investing big time in that are a complete mismatch on ideal client profile and that give you zero opportunity to educate and build trust. That's how you free up the budget for this. But the reality is, this is just time and labor. You don't really need much budget. You already have access to this room, right? Assuming there's a conference room or classroom in your facility. You already have an email marketing program up and running, I hope. You already have a CRM, a customer relationship management database, and a well-organized, prioritized account-based marketing list, right? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about you sitting down with one of your subject matter experts 6 weeks out and brainstorming for a half hour to an hour what should be on the agenda and looping in someone from your marketing team to help build the slides for that. Getting together a week or two before and doing and fine tuning and doing a dress rehearsal on that. It's not going to cost any money. I don't know. Maybe you do it over lunch to get your subject matter expert to be a little more cooperative. No real expense there. You're having people in for a breakfast event or lunch and learn. What's it going to cost to bring in breakfast for 15, 20 people or lunch for 15, 20 people? Yeah, it's an expense, but we're not talking about $8 cups of coffee in a fancy hotel or $15 cups of coffee in a convention center. We're talking about, like, in the US, this might be bringing in like Panera or Dunkin' Donuts, or for lunch, you're bringing in pizzas and salads or deli sandwiches or something. This is stuff that, like, in the US, this is a few $100s or your local currency equivalent for 15 or 20 people. It's so small that it's likely smaller than your flights to one conference. The difference in like cost is staggering. And the difference in who's going to be in the room and the amount of attention you have is staggering. You want to get rid of that loss factor where 80, 90% of the people at the conference are not your ideal client profile? Great. When it's your own event, guess who controls who gets invited to the event? You. You only invite them if they're on your target account list. Now, what I would encourage you is, especially the first couple events, do not get greedy. What do I mean by don't get greedy? If they work in IT at a target account, I don't care whether they're the college intern, the individual contributor who was just hired 3 weeks ago out of school, or I don't care what their job title is. It's your foot in the door. Start somewhere. If someone that they work for said, yeah, you should go to this event, let us know what you think, and they come back and like, wow, this is amazing. You got to come next time. This was great. You accomplished exactly what you're looking for. So don't get greedy. Sure, you want eventually to have really good surface area in that target account, multiple stakeholders from each target account attending multiple events of yours. So you really, really shape the criteria that they use in your category. But early on, don't be short-sighted. Any foot in the door that sees you as an expert, as a trusted advisor, as a consultant, as a teacher in your category is extraordinarily valuable. Because when that person registers and they get the email back that says, oh, who else should attend? We know when it comes to cybersecurity best practices for mid-market manufacturing companies, it truly takes a village. It takes a team. There's typically people involved from operations, engineering, support, compliance, cybersecurity, finance. So with that, who else from your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two, and I'll just remind you that teams that learn together grow together. And what you're doing when you're getting multiple people from the same company attending this event together, you're proactively driving alignments in the formative stages of the buyer's journey and the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey. If you're just like every other bozo that you compete against, and you're only in there for the final 17% of the chance of their journey, you've completely missed the opportunity because they've already fallen in love with someone else's thought leadership content and educational events experience. And if you're only in there for the final 17% or part of that last 17%, it's too late, baby. It's too late. Is that Carole King? Seriously, it's too late. You can't, the only thing that's going to shape their mind at that point is undercutting on price. And that's not where I want you to be. That's not where your boss wants you to be. It's not where your board wants you to be. We want you to command premium pricing because of your deep expertise and the strong brand that you have in your category for a very specific kind of buyer persona and a very specific kind of company. So we need to dominate, we need to crush, we need to monopolize the surface area throughout 100% of the buyer's journey, especially in those formative stages, that first 83%. What are my formative stages? If you've ever heard of kids and teens, the formative years where you shape their values, you shape their beliefs, you shape their habits. It's the same thing. This is shaping their beliefs, how they look at other digital infrastructure options, how they look at other co-location options in your category. And when you do this well, month after month, and more people from the same account keep coming back because they're learning a ton from hanging out with your client-facing team members, your subject matter experts, magical things start to happen with your pipeline. From a tactical perspective, let's say the event is from 8:30 to 10 in the morning. From 8:30 to 9, they arrive, have a little bit of networking from some breakfast. From 9 to 9:40, you have a fantastic educational program where the slides, the content is so incredibly valuable that you're highly confident that if this was a breakout session at one of those national and global conferences, that you would for sure have standing room only, have a perfect report card on the mobile app, and would be top of the list for who gets invited back next year. Everyone that was sitting in the seats at the beginning of the talk is there at the end of the talk, and their jaw is just dropping. They just can't believe the amount of action items that they've jotted down, and they have final clarity on this. So that's the formal part of your program, of course, because it's small, make it highly participatory, give them a chance to ask questions. And for anyone that wants to afterwards, you're in a co-location facility. What do you do when you have IT directors in a co-location facility? Take them on a tour for anyone that wants. Lather, rinse, repeat. Do this month after month. That's the playbook for how a co-location sales rep can build trust and credibility with skeptical IT professionals. If you're getting good value so far from what we're talking about at this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, would mean a lot if you could simply hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching us on, or if you're listening, rate us and review us. We're also super curious to understand what it is that you do, what your company does in the data center ecosystem. So leave that in the comments as well. So what's up next? Next topic we're going to talk about is getting buy-in. That's a great one. How do data center marketers get the buy-in needed to lead their company's growth? How do data center marketers get the buy-in that's needed to lead their company's growth? I think the number one predictor of whether a data center marketer is going to get buy-in to lead their company growth or not is how strategic that marketer's role is relative to the other leaders in their company. A very straightforward back of the napkin way to look at this is when you look at the organizational chart for this company. If there's a chief sales officer and a chief operating officer and a chief finance officer, is there a chief marketing officer, or is it just a VP of marketing or a marketing director or a marketing manager or a marketing coordinator? And when we ladder down from chief marketing officer, CMO, down to a VP of marketing, down to a marketing director, down to a marketing manager, to a marketing coordinator, every one of those rungs, every one of those steps down usually means that the employer is trying to save money and going cheap. And the reason that they're doing that is they don't believe in what you're doing, or they don't have the resources to actually do it. But what they're telling you is they'll pay top of the market for world-class A-level talent for sales and for finance and for operations and for technology. But when it comes to marketing, no, we're going to expect a miracle, and we're going to pay minimum wage, and we're going to try to get someone to do the job of what someone would need 10 years of experience to do, but we're going to throw that at someone that's like has no experience and see what actually ends up happening. And exaggerating a little bit, but this goes on all the time. So getting buy-in starts with selecting a company to build your career around that actually values what you bring to the table. And has you at an appropriate level in the company where you're on equal footing to other leaders in the company, and gives you an appropriate budget and gives you appropriate team resources to realistically execute on all of this. What usually ends up happening by default, the lower the level the marketer is in the organization, the more likely it is that they're basically a glorified helper for the sales team. I don't know why they just don't call it sales helper or sales assistant or sales administrator or something like that, because they're not really getting to do any marketing at that point. They're just basically administrative support for the sales team. In order for a marketing leader to actually be able to lead marketing, they need to not only be able to support the sales team, but they need to be able to support the post-sales support and services team. And they need to be able to support the product team. And they need to be able to support the channel partnerships team. And they for sure need to be able to support the HR team. In other words, they actually need to be able to work on projects that don't depend on getting a deal closed in the next 30 days. Because if 100% of their time and effort and budget is going to marketing initiatives with quotes around marketing that have to see return on investment in the next 30 days, I can tell you for sure, there's very little marketing that's going on. They're basically the gopher. They're basically the lackey, the assistant, the punching bag for the sales team. So when it comes to getting buy-in, a lot of it starts by putting yourself in a situation where they're actually buying into you, by putting you at the appropriate level of the company. So one, they have a compensation package that's appropriate for someone with your level of responsibility and expectations. And second, that they're not expecting one person to do the job of 8 and expecting you to burn out and be turned over every 6 months. That's a big one too, is to look at average tenure and Glassdoor reviews across different kinds of functions, and Indeed reviews across different kinds of functions in your company. And this is where you start to see that there's an intersection between marketing and sales enablement and customer marketing and product marketing and employer marketing and employer branding. I've had a couple of interesting data center specialized recruiters that I've interviewed on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And one most recently is from Texas, Roxanne Zaponik, who specializes in data center construction. We talked about how employers, to really be competitive at this stage, need to recognize that most candidates are a lot like prospects and clients. They're doing a ton of research on their own before they get to your interview and your interview process. And a lot of what shapes their interest in working with your company is what they discover online. And much the same way when you're looking to buy something, Amazon reviews, Yelp reviews, Google reviews, Facebook reviews massively shape their perception. So employer marketing, employer videos, a day in the life of, had an enormous impact on recruiting the best and brightest. And if you bury your marketing person in the sales organization, guess what's never going to get done by talent acquisition, by HR? Never going to be any good employer marketing. If you bury the marketer underneath sales, guess what's going to happen with channel marketing and channel partnerships? They're just going to be focused on flogging, on beating the crap out of their channel partners to get as much productivity, as much production out of them in the next 30 days with no thought whatsoever into channel partner enablement or recruiting new channel partners. Like, it's just impossible for that to happen when you have this mindset of like everyone else is a C-level or VP level and marketing as a coordinator or an assistant being paid peanuts. So that's the first issue with how marketers can get buy-in needed to lead their company's growth, is don't put yourself in a situation where, for lack of a better word, the decks are stacked against you, where it's a quasi-abusive kind of thing, where gaslighting is routinely used, and you're made to feel like crap because you can't achieve, because the expectations were wildly unrealistic relative to the investment level. That said, I think a lot of marketing leaders, and I've seen a lot of the big co-location operators do this, treat their team as like an internal marketing agency with lots of different clients, where sales is a really important client, but not the only client. Product is an important client, but not the only client. HR, talent acquisition, is an important client, but not the only client. Channel partnerships, so you have, basically you run this where you have different campaigns for different kinds of teams within the company that each need to figure out a way to have different resources that they bring to the table to make this work. So a lot of the buy-in works the same way that you would have if you were an external agency, except you're internal, meaning you have first dibs on everything. So you'd start with strategy, go-to-market strategy. You'd start with a pilot project to prove that it's working. You would try to increase the pace, the speed of learning to get your cycles moving faster, to get your feedback loop moving faster. You would try to get to product market fit as rapidly as possible, accelerating everything that you needed to do to get to that PMF, to get to go-to-market fit, to get to channel partner market fit. So you have a strong instinct about who the right clients are, what the unit economics are, what the metrics are, and everything. You'd run this a lot more like not putting all your eggs in one basket and just in revenue. And sure, everything you do has a revenue impact and a brand impact. But what ends up happening is if sales is driving all the priorities, is you're going to end up defaulting to only doing campaigns that have attribution that tells you that it's working, with quotes around working. Meaning that if you use conversion tracking on Google or Meta or LinkedIn or HubSpot or anyone, all of these marketing technology platforms are designed to make it look like their platform is fantastic and everything else sucks. And in the reality, once we've gotten to the point where cookies are being blocked like crazy, and once we've gotten to the point where you have 50, 60, 50 plus, more than half of searches to a traditional Google search page are now clickless, and pretty much every social media platform is severely penalizing organic posts that have external URLs, we are living in a very, very different world where all the traditional attribution models are completely ineffective at being able to figure out what's really, really going on. So how do you get around this? For sure, I've been talking about this for quite some time. Every time you have a touch point like a lead generation form, how did you hear about us? Every time someone from your sales team opens up a new deal, required contact property, required field in prospect's own words, how do they hear about us? When a deal gets over the finish line to go into closed one for the account manager reinforcing. So we need a large pool of data on users telling you in their own words how they heard about us. So we're not totally dependent on first touch, last touch, multi-touch, all these crazy models, spaghetti models that reached their peak of effectiveness in the late 2010s, early 2020s, and have rapidly been declining in effectiveness ever since because of the zero-click searches on a traditional search results page, because people are exiting. They're moving away from using a traditional Google search to now asking the exact same question on ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini as the near one-to-one replacement for a Google search. All of these trends make it nearly impossible for you to magically have the cookie-based tracking work anymore as these pools get smaller and smaller, as privacy zealots block and all this stuff. So we need different ways of actually figuring out what's working. And what ends up happening, again, when marketing is at too low of a level, they're always pressured and always bullied to nearly all of their time going to sales. And they're forced to pick marketing initiatives that make it look like it's working when those things are not working. Vanity metrics, the exact kind of vanity metrics that make someone super excited to be at a conference with 3,000 attendees when 88% of those attendees are not your addressable market. And 12%, looks like an awfully big, looks like a needle in a haystack, right? Out of 3,000 people that are there, 360 matter. And it's not so much that 360 are that many people. It's just like, how are you going to get 45 minutes with each of those 360 people? Oh, we have great SDRs. We'll book meetings. Good luck. Let me know how that works out and what those meetings are actually doing. Oh, we'll invite them to a party where we have a great band. Okay. Well, they'll remember that you had a cool party. If it was that good of a party, they might remember with a few less brain cells in the morning. They'll probably be really hoarse, but they may not have any idea what your company does. You certainly didn't educate and build trust at that kind of event. Best case scenario, you're kind of trying to bribe them into a little bit of a brand halo to thinking that they had a great time at your party. So they'll for sure be receptive to your outbound post-conference. But you know what actually makes people receptive to your outbound post-conference? when you're seen as a thought leader. Every year, LinkedIn does a big B2B thought leadership study with the PR giant Edelman. And in the most recent study, LinkedIn and Edelman found that when you're seen as a thought leader, it's 95% more likely that your prospects will respond to your outbound. So 95% lift in outbound effectiveness when they see you, your team members, and your company as thought leaders in your segment. I don't know how you get to be a thought leader from your booth. I don't know how you get to be a thought leader on the golf course. I don't know how you get to be a thought leader by having a cabana party. Fun, right? Soccer matches, football matches, baseball games. I'm a big baseball fan. I love going to baseball games, but you're probably not doing much education and trust building. And if you do more than a 5-minute check the boxes type of Canva or Google Slides presentation in the box, they're going to shut off pretty quickly. And they're going to think that like you tricked them and manipulated them to thinking you were inviting them to a sporting event when it's just really an aggressive sales pitch. So does that build trust? How do we educate and build trust? Marketers, if they do this right, need to be the big internal champion for educating and building trust, getting the right strategy in place, understanding the customer insights, getting the right subject matter experts together, ensuring that the right people from sales and account management and product and innovation and the executive team are all participating in these initiatives. In a self-driven journey, in a self-driven buyer's world, sales needs to be prepared to come in much earlier than they historically have. So they have a big role in awareness and consideration with the right people from their target accounts. And conversely, marketers need to be prepared to go much deeper into the journey than they ever had before in the past, because it's not enough to just support early lead generation. It's critical to work hand in hand with their counterparts in sales development, business development, account executives, account managers to have fantastic lead generation, nurturing, saturate as many of those 28 touch points as possible throughout the full journey, and even post-purchase, making sure that they're working really, really tightly with customer success, with customer education. So there's fantastic onboarding. So your clients get as rapidly as possible to initial value, intended value, and extended value. So customer marketing, customer education, customer enablement can take over and really, really take those relationships to the next level. Of course, channel partnerships need their own playbook. Product marketing needs to be infused in there at the right time. And of course, talent acquisition is a series of funnels as well with candidates. So to get the right buy-in needed to lead their company's growth, I'd like to see a lot more marketers leading internal education. Because if you're the only one in your organization that understands how 56% of the journey used to happen before you, and now it's 83%, and your buyers don't want to spend time with sales and marketing. If you're the only one in your organization that understands that, you're going to have a very, very, very uphill battle. So I think your internal clients need education as well to understand market trends, to understand what's working well with other companies, to understand what's not working well with other companies, and what that transformation looks like to help your go-to-market team survive and thrive in an AI-centric, self-driven buyer's journey. These are some of the things that a data center marketer needs to be thinking about as they look to get buy-in to lead their company's growth. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to hit the like button to help spread the word. Okay, what is up next? How do edge data center providers generate consistent new opportunities? How do edge data center providers generate consistent new sales opportunities? That is a terrific question. And so an edge data center is typically a smaller footprint data center than a traditional co-location facility. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. And there tends to be more of these edge data centers because you're trying to get them as close as possible to the user. So historically, edge data centers have been especially valuable for latency sensitive applications, but they're increasingly also being used to support niche versions of latency sensitive applications, like certain kinds of AI, certain kinds of IoT applications, smart cities, autonomous driving. And then there's certain kinds of, I've seen edge providers as well that are thriving by putting much smaller footprint data centers, edge data centers, in underserved rural communities. Like if you think about in the US, the tier one locations being like Northern Virginia, Chicago, Dallas, Northern California, Southern California, New York, you had 5 or 6 big locations. And then tier two would be like Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Portland, Atlanta, Charlotte, like, and then there's tier three. Well, tier four would be the next level below that, much, much smaller communities where the population density is much thinner, rural, underserved communities. And Edge can do especially well there as well. So when it comes to being a edge data center provider, most of the reason that you're going to win those opportunities is because someone with an IT budget and strong IT needs recognize that there's extreme value in your hyper-specific location. It's not like they're going to one of the big data center operators and they're like, oh, we need a co-location facility somewhere in the Los Angeles metro area, New York metro area, London, greater London area, somewhere in Singapore or something like that. No, they're a lot more specific. They need it to be at a very, very precise location at near a particular street corner. Maybe it's a financial trading application. Again, maybe it's something to do with a smart city or autonomous driving kind of pilot or something like that, but they're hyper specific. So what that means is your playbook for lead generation and nurturing and demand generation can borrow a lot of what you would do for a co-location data center, but it's even more precise, meaning that distance radius plays a much, much bigger role. A lot of times too, I think with edge data centers, I think you're going to see more long distance interest than traditional co-location. In other words, like with traditional co-location, server hugging has been around for decades, and it's widely accepted that a lot of IT decision makers decide on a co-location facility because it's close to where they work or where they live. I think with edge data centers, IT professionals have no illusion of the idea that with hyper precise location planning and lots of different locations that they can be close by to everywhere. So when it comes to edge locations, I think they're a lot more realistic, that they're putting their users ahead of their own selfish needs to be near where the server is physically located. As a result, you'll end up with the long distance playbook, the digital playbook, being significantly more important for edge data centers than you would in a traditional co-location kind of environment. But either way, it's about being really aware of who your ideal clients are, who your most important personas are, and figuring out a way to get in front of them early and often so you can educate and build trust with them throughout that full buyer's journey. It's just that, like, if you were running revenue or commercial or marketing or go to market for a co-location operator that has 5 locations and each of them are in completely different geographic areas, it's 5 different sales and marketing playbooks for both your hyper local events and your digital events. It's largely the same thing with Edge, except I would put a little bit more weighting into the digital events as opposed to the in-person events. So if you're really, let's say you have 20 Edge locations, and it would be impossible for you to run a monthly event that supports each of those Edge locations each month. So what's a compromise? Maybe 4 times a year you're doing an in-person event, and 12 months a year you're doing a webinar series. So there's ways to address this, even for teams that are relatively small. But for the consistent opportunity generation, again, I want to be super specific about who the ideal clients are. Usually your website, your case studies, your testimonials, your logos, certainly your CRM, certainly your CFO, your CRO can give you an idea as to where your best clients are located. When you look at your biggest source of revenue, your biggest source of profitability, how big or small those companies are. In other words, how big do they need to be to afford your minimums? At what point are they so big that the likelihood of you being successful with that client falls off a cliff? So that gives you your employee size band for prospecting and qualifying. And then are there certain industries that are a better fit than others? Just like with co-location, edge data centers need to worry about the match between your accreditations and your compliance and your certifications and their geographic location and the industries that they're located within. For example, if you want to sell to healthcare clients, especially in the US, but in many regions of the world, you need to understand like what kind of compliance requirements your data center facilities need to have and your staff needs to have in order for you to be able to, the training that they need to have in order to be able to consistently win and maintain the confidence level that a healthcare IT executive would have to place their servers, their networking infrastructure equipment in one of your edge facilities. So geographic, company size, industry match, that gives you your target account list and then your targeted buyer personas, and prioritize based on which personas have the biggest impact. I don't see the typical buyer personas for edge being that different than the typical buyer personas for colocation. There's almost always a direct IT professional that's usually ranked first or second. There's almost always a channel partner professional that's ranked second or third. Topics are a little bit different. The applications driving edge are usually a little bit different than what's driving a colocation need. Again, this will all surface in your customer insight research when you're figuring out the 5 or 6 big goals, the 5 or 6 big challenges for each of those personas. And then it's a very, very similar playbook to what you'd use for a colocation operator. 10 or 12 topics for each of those personas, cover one of those once a month on a digital webinar series. Obviously record, repurpose, and try to run some of those as in-person events as well. I know with edge facilities, sometimes they're so small that you don't have a classroom or a foyer or a conference room, but if you do, it's a gift that I would encourage you to be using for several time slots on a pretty regular basis. In a perfect world, I'd like to see you using it for a couple of hours almost every single week of the year, 30, 40 times in the course of the year. If you're spread really thin, assuming that you have space in each of these facilities, maybe the compromise is every other month or at the absolute minimum quarterly. But what I want you to be doing is inviting the right people from your target accounts to educational events where they learn and grow with your client-facing team members about topics that are top of mind for them, that they've expressed in their own words, their big goals and their big challenges. When you do this over and over again, it's a lot more likely that they'll bring their coworkers with them. You get to meet the full decision committee, and you'll really, really stack the decks in your favor with generating consistent new opportunities. And if this is working, but it's not enough opportunities, what that's probably telling you is to just do more. If you have 20 if you have 20 edge facilities right now, and you can only run an in-person event quarterly, maybe your team needs to grow a little bit. Maybe it's a second, realize that okay, we put a $80,000, $120,000 a year person or whatever this is, and another $50,000 in support budget into this. And when we do that, we get $1 million of ARR, annual recurring revenue growth out of the $200,000 investment. Well, if those numbers aren't getting your CFO and your board excited about doubling or tripling down, I don't know what else will. So yeah, just be aware of what's working, play the long game, be as client-centric as possible, educate and build trust. It's about the right people in the right potential accounts, the right prospects, the right future clients, to see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people in your region, in your country, on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with edge data centers. And to the extent that the right people and the right companies have that impression of your client-facing team members, a lot of fantastic things happen with new sales opportunity generation. But yeah, there's 28 touch points, 25, 30 touch points typically between complete stranger and purchase decision. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I want you to be in on as many of those 28 touch points as possible. Control that surface area, control that relationship, get them to come back over and over and over again with more and more people from each of their teams to continue learning with your team members, growing together, and you're proactively driving alignment in the formative stages of the buyer's journey. That's what I'd be thinking about for how an edge data center provider can generate consistent new sales opportunities. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll tackle 3 more big questions that go-to-market sales and marketing professionals are facing throughout the global data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, founder of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, our weekly live on LinkedIn and YouTube, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about throughout the global data center ecosystem. So if you have an idea for a topic or a question or challenge that you and your team are currently struggling with, we'd love to know about it. Simply drop that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue of topics to cover in an upcoming episode. So what's up next? So far we've talked this week about co-location, and we've talked about edge. Now we're going to go to the other extreme, hyperscale, huge data centers. So how does a hyperscale data center operator build a quality pipeline, a quality sales pipeline? How does a hyperscale data center operator build a quality sales pipeline? That is a terrific question. So the key difference between building sales pipeline for co-location as compared to building pipeline for hyperscale is, with hyperscale, the deals tend to be much larger. The unit economics are an order of magnitude bigger most of the time, other things being equal, compared to co-location, usually at least one or two more zeros on the average deal size. However, the flip side is there's a lot fewer potential buyers because there's thousands of co-location operators, and in most major markets around the world, there's only a couple dozen potential hyperscale buyers, a lot of which you likely have already heard of. Sure. A lot of companies would love to have their anchor tenant be Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services or Oracle or Alibaba. But the reality is it takes a certain amount of capital, takes a certain amount of experience, it takes a certain amount of brand reputation, and frankly, a certain amount of go-to-market execution to put yourself in a situation where you're primed to win those huge deals. And when it comes to like the anchor tenants for hyperscale, a lot of that rubs up against the adjacent sector of the data center ecosystem that's dominated by wholesale data center providers or wholesale data center developers, where they're building to suit or they're looking to lease an empty shell. Very, very different than a co-location operator, where an average deal just may be like a cabinet or two or something like that. So when it comes to building a quality pipeline for a hyperscale data center operator, it's very unusual for a hyperscale data center operator to hire team members, sales professionals, account managers, marketers in a hyperscale environment that are brand new to the industry. In other words, usually co-location is a much more forgiving environment for go-to-market professionals to learn in the early stages of their career as opposed to hyperscale. So usually most of the team members that you're hiring in engineering and development and operations and marketing and sales and account management in a hyperscale environment tend to be somewhere between highly experienced and industry veterans. It's not typically the place where you see a lot of people that are like, where it's their first or second job right out of school. So there's a certain amount of, when you're trying to figure out where you want to specialize, it's usually a function of where the founding team has had the most success in earlier stops on their career that are directly or indirectly related to what they're doing now. And that resume experience, that CV experience, that LinkedIn profile experience that the founding team has usually goes a long way to deciding what the plan is for who the ideal clients are, for the master tenant, who's the ideal clients that they want to be renting this huge amount of space to, which could be an entire campus, It could be an entire building. It could be multiple buildings on a campus. There's a lot of different ways to potentially divide this up, but hyperscale is these are enormous relationships. So there's going to for sure be revenue concentration. Because there's revenue concentration, there's financial risk, which is the reason why all of these decisions on who to target, who's the right person, is very, very much a two-way street. You're interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. And if you think that co-location buyers are skeptical, cynical, sales allergic, it's like next level as you move into hyperscale buyers, just because they tend to be bigger companies. They tend to be bigger budgets. There's a lot more on the line. There's a lot more even experience relative to an average co-location buyer. And as a result, like, they expect, it's not like your thought leadership is going to be a differentiator. It's like, if you don't have world-class thought leadership, it's going to eliminate you, because there's a really, really good chance that it's someone's job before they get to a preliminary meeting with your company to go consume your thought leadership, to learn about how you stack up, your thought process, your belief system, what you invest in, what you prioritize across different members of your team. So this could be that they're watching webinars. It could be that they're watching conference recordings. It could be that they're downloading reports. It could be that they're interacting with tools on your website, or all of the above. But just recognize that if you think the self-driven buyer's journey is high stakes for co-location, it's like next level high stakes for hyperscale. Because instead of, like, with co-location, an average deal could be, I don't know, maybe $100,000 deal, a $50,000 deal, $25,000 deal, or your local currency equivalent. Like, there's no small deals in hyperscale. They're all long-term. They're all huge. Most are 7 figures. Some are even 8 figures. Every once in a while, you have some smaller ones that are in the mid to high 6 figures, but they're all enormous deals with enormous companies. And because these companies most of the time are several orders of magnitude larger than theirs, larger than your company, a lot of times they're dictating terms. So again, this is where these are board level discussions on who to target in your particular company as to who's qualified, who's a good fit, risk, what you're willing to, risk management type of issues, financial underwriting kind of issues, payment terms, and integration, cost structures. There's so much that comes into play that's so much more complicated with hyperscale compared to co-location, traditional co-location type of environment. So what the quality pipeline largely comes down to is having strong agreement among your leadership team about which companies are on that target account list and how we're going to generate leads and educate and build trust with those leads once they're already generated. So yes, thought leadership, yes, educational events, yes, in-person events, yes, virtual events, yes, email marketing. It's all of the above. And the good part is your unit economics are so outrageously high that you can actually afford to make these investments to do this the right way. A perfect example, like low-end co-location in the US could be as little as a few $100s a month, meaning that even on a 36-month agreement, that client may not even be worth $10,000 over the course of that lifetime agreement. Now, that's the extreme example. That's where, like, the real entry-level version of co-location rubs up against the upper end of, like, dedicated server hosting or something like that. Because of that, if a client's only worth $10,000, and it's divided up where the first year is only worth $2,400 or $3,600 or something like that, US or your local currency equivalent, you more than likely can't afford to run something like LinkedIn ads. You may struggle to be able to afford to have in-person events or even to be able to do webinars the right way. And as a result, your sign-up process needs to look a lot more like e-commerce and a lot more like a sales-assisted process. It's the other extreme with hyperscale, where the unit economics are so outrageously large that there's very little that you can't afford to do. So it's just really a matter of figuring out in these accounts who you think is going to be the most important person relative to their company size and relative to your company size in the geographic region where you're located in. And on a hyperscale go-to-market playbook, it's very, very common to find that you'll need a minimum of 4 or 5 different buyer personas that you're educating and building trust with. And if you're developing a facility, a project that doesn't exist today, and you're working hand in hand with the developers to make this happen, there's a host of external community-based stakeholders that you may not think are important, but they can block you, so they're important. So it's just more at stake, bigger deals, more complex GTM, but the good part is you actually have the unit economics to do it. The challenging part is just making sure that your leadership team has a realistic grasp on how complex these buying decisions are and are supporting with the right talent and the right resources to make this sales pipeline generation a reality. There's also 2 distinctly different schools of thought among smaller companies that are relatively new to being in the hyperscale go-to-market business, and the largely 2 different schools of thought on this is aggressively building your own team versus punting this completely to outsiders. And by punting this completely to outsiders, it could be channel partners like traditional managed service providers, integrators, assuming they have relationships with hyperscalers, which they more than likely don't. Master agents, more likely. Master agent companies, a lot more likely. Real estate agents, way, way more likely. So there's different categories of third-party channel partners that could lessen the need for you to hire a team or a pod of marketers, sales developers, or all the above. I think in most cases, what you typically see is both, because you will miss a significant amount of market opportunities of addressable market if you're leaning 100% on both. The challenge too is if you just rely 100% on your channel partners, is like, who really owns that relationship? Where's the trust? Is the trust with your company or is the trust with the channel partner? It's a good question. I don't think enough people ask it on a regular basis. No matter how trusted that channel partner is, that trust doesn't automatically transfer. It can transfer over time if you do a fantastic job with account management and you do a fantastic job of a lot of what account executives look like going forward is being project managers for your internal champion, helping to support your internal champion getting the buy-in that they need across their team and other key teams throughout their company. In this particular case, it could be external stakeholders as well, but being a fantastic project manager is fantastic support of that person, of your main point person on the inside for doing this. It's increasingly difficult to do this if the relationship that your internal champion has is so much stronger with your channel partner than they are with you, especially if your channel partner could care less about that trust actually transferring. So that's a whole separate Q&A on that, as well as how to not only get your channel partners to trust you, but to get that trust to actually transfer so it sets you up for long-term success with that hyperscale client. But there's no easy answers on all of this, but what tends to happen is the more you operationalize your playbook, the more you figure out what's working for your brand and in your geographic markets, what's the playbook where you've been most successful, then you can start to operationalize this and start to repeat a lot more about what's working, as opposed to making everything an experiment. What a lot of people choose to do as well, and I think a lot of recruiters in this ecosystem help to facilitate this, is they try to poach talent from competitors, from direct competitors, and figure that that person that did that job role for another hyperscale data center operator will have all the answers. And that only tends to be the case if you have an extraordinary coincidence of context and timing, meaning that the person that you hired happened to be at that company when they're at your exact growth stage, in your exact geographic locations, going after the exact same target clients. And because of that, they have a lot of highly relevant muscle memory. If they were there, if they're a logo hire, meaning that your board was like super impressed by the employer that they work with, and no one ever got fired for hiring fill in the blank. The challenge with the logo hires is that particular person may not be as resourceful as what you need relative to where your company is at in your particular growth stage. This is a massive, massive problem that you see with venture-backed companies, private equity-backed companies, when they take on some new board members that want to replace your current talent with what they feel is a talent upgrade. The problem with the talent upgrade is if it's not executed properly, your talent upgrade ends up coming in with a lot of deer in headlights moments when it comes to operating in environments where there's a lot less certainty than they had in their current job, meaning that they may have been at a particular incumbent market leading company when the sales enablement playbook was on version 117, and there was 800 people in their department, and they're coming into your department, and sales enablement playbook is on version 2, and there's 4 coworkers in their department. Completely different context. And SaaS figured out this pain. SaaS figured out this mistake a long, long time ago. A lot of data center operators refuse to learn from that very, very relevant parallel situation. And all I can say is, like, be super, super careful with hiring to make sure that the context is what you think it is, as opposed to going with the no one ever got fired for buying IBM kind of mindset applied to hyperscale data center operators. So when it comes to building a quality pipeline, same basic strategy: educational events, multiple stakeholders from those educational events, have them coming back month after month to learn from your internal experts, stacking the decks in your favor, teaching them your best practices and methodologies about other companies similar to theirs have navigated this. In a perfect world, a lot of those public facing small events should progress pretty quickly to the point where they're like, well, there's 3 people, 4 people from our team. Why don't you just come on site internally and present to our whole team? We're doing an offsite next Friday. Be like, oh yeah, it's awesome. You know, we'll come in for the lunch slot. We'll bring in lunch with us, and we'll talk for 45 minutes about cybersecurity best practices, or load balancing, or business continuity best practices, or power and cooling, whatever it is that's top of mind and relevant for what they care about right now. But yeah, in a lot of ways, the lead generation that you're doing for your in-person events, for your webinars, can be parlayed pretty quickly with account-based marketing to going from having a foot in the door with a couple people on your team, on their team, to having a foot in the door with the entire team. So yeah, I would encourage you to think about that playbook as well, to do magical things with quality pipeline. The only thing that I will tell you with all of these suggestions is none of them are completely new to hyperscale data center operators. Most hyperscale data center operators that I've been tracking since the early 2010s have been running a version of this playbook since the early 2010s, and they've continued to invest in getting better at it year after year after year. And I know this because in addition to consulting, in addition to the podcast interviews, a lot of information is shared in job descriptions. And if you look at the playbook that they're revealing about what they're looking for with candidates, there is a level of sophistication that blindsides a lot of people that are relatively new to standing up a hyperscale go-to-market playbook for a data center operator. So in other words, like, these investments that you're making are not differentiators anymore. They are investments that if you don't make, you will be disqualified. They will not take you seriously. It would be like a prospect or client going to your website and getting a 404 error. It would be that extreme. So in other words, if you don't have world-class thought leadership, you're not going to pass diligence. It's that simple. So do what it takes to understand exactly what your addressable market is, exactly who the ideal clients are, exactly what the buyer personas are, and make sure you make the right investments to having world-class content, world-class educational events, world-class thought leadership in the areas, because in a world where 83% of the action is happening without you being in the room, what used to happen in face-to-face conversations is now happening through content and educational events experiences. Make sure that your investments reflect that. Incredibly, incredibly important. Do not put 100% of your resources into the final 17% of your journey and massively neglect the first 83%. We need to transform your client-facing team members, your account executives, your sales development, business development team members. It is marketers. It is incredibly, incredibly important that they collaborate to be very heavily involved in your ideal prospects and your ideal future clients' professional development and learning and development process in a way that positions you as the go-to expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with that particular client's hyperscale needs in a particular job function in a certain company in a geographic region of roughly that size tied to a certain kind of industry. And the more focused you are on hyperscale, you're going to very quickly figure out that there's only a couple dozen companies that really matter in your region. So what can you do to saturate the surface area as much as possible? Educate and build trust to completely dominate as much of that first 83% as possible. Literally did a consultation with a mid-level executive from one of the big 3 hyperscalers, I think it was last year. And he told me point blank that he is losing deals because his direct competitor has a book and he does not. A book, a paper book, you know, the kind that you'd go to bookstores and they'd have a spine and a glossy cover and everything, like books, like the kind that I wrote a book for Microsoft Press 25 years ago. He's being eliminated because he's not seen as a thought leader because he doesn't have a book. Is a book a major barrier for a hyperscale data center operator that's 5, 10, 15 people on their marketing and sales enablement team? Sure as hell shouldn't be. What do you put in this book? The answers to their biggest questions. These suggestions, the blueprint for how they can achieve their biggest goals, how they can overcome some of their biggest challenges that they've articulated in their buyer persona. Being seen as a thought leader is incredibly, incredibly important, but it's not going to be what wins you deals anymore. But not being it can be what gets you disqualified pretty early and pretty often. And that's the answer with all of this, is we need to get you in there as early as possible and as often as possible with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So you get the heck out of the vendor box and are seen as experts, trusted advisors, teachers, consultants, and thought leaders. The more that's at stake, the more your competitors are going to invest really, really aggressively, and you better be prepared to meet and exceed what they're doing in a way that truly differentiates you as the best option in your marketplace. That's what I'd be thinking about for how a hyperscale data center operator can build a quality pipeline. Next question, what do we got? Oh, by the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, be sure to hit the like button. And depending on where you're watching or listening, we'd love if you could leave us a rating and a review as well. And especially, we're always curious to know what you do in the data center ecosystem. So you can leave a little context about your job role, what your company does. That would be awesome as well. How does a data center operator stand out from the competition? How does a data center operator stand out from the competition? Okay, just to review a little bit in terms of context of how the data center ecosystem is organized. There's data center operators, there's data center technology companies, there's data center facilities related companies, there's data center construction, real estate investment companies, and there's outsourced sales and marketing companies. So at DCSMI, we track 57 different business models in the data center ecosystem. 5 of those business models are data center operators. Data center operators can be co-location data center operators, hyperscale data center operators, edge data center operators, wholesale data center developers, providers, as well as modular data center providers, operators. So with all of that in mind, what can a data center operator do to stand out from the competition? The first place to start with is we need to, in a self-driven buyer's journey, which is fueled by all of the AI growth, it means that we're not having face-to-face conversations or Zoom conversations or phone conversations. We're not having very many conversations anymore with our prospects and clients until they're almost ready to buy. This is very, very different than as recently as a decade ago, when if you did most things right, you could count on the fact that your sales team was in there for roughly the second half of their research and decision-making process. Because of, and it got to the point where you were locked out of the first half, because in the first half of that decade, mobile device adoption, search engine adoption, social media adoption, interest in reviews, social proof, webinars, podcasts, YouTube videos were consuming the first half of that journey. People just doing tons of research on their own before they got to you. Over the past decade, all of those continue to be factors, although traditional search is no longer as big a deal as Gen AI. We'll get to that in a moment. All of those continue to be factors. But in addition to that, 10 years of digital transformation, tens of millions of people that got really used to working from home in the beginning of the 2020s. A lot of baby boomers that were laggards with some of those adoption curves being retiring, and now Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles. And on top of that, the last 2-3 years, the massive adoption curve on generative AI and all the applications on our phones and on our desktops with the large language models like ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, Perplexity, and Claude have replaced a lot of traditional search activity, a lot of clickless search queries happening on traditional Google search engine results pages. But in general, I think about my own personal habits of things I used to look up on Google. I don't go to Google. Why would I want to have to click through on 4, 5, 6 different pages? I just ask one of the chat apps for an answer. And for a huge percentage of your addressable market, your ideal clients, your targeted prioritized buyer personas, they've done the exact same thing. And as a result of that, it's dramatically changed buyer preferences to the point where it used to be that you were in there for the final 44%. You were locked out for the first 56, 57%, but you could count on the fact that if you did most things right, you were at least in there for the final 43, 44% of the research and decision-making process. Now, even if you do everything spectacularly, if you don't change the context of how your company is viewed, you're marginalized, you're ignored for the first 83% of the buyer's journey. That's research directly from Gartner. So what that means is you only have the final 17% of the game to play on the field and influence the outcome of the game. I'm using game metaphorically for sales cycle, buyer's journey, research, and decision-making process. That's not a lot of surface area. And that's a huge problem. When it comes to standing out from the competition, I want you to think about 3 different categories of competitors. There's direct competitors. These are the obvious ones that you likely really know about because you're losing deals and you're constantly being played up in beauty contests and comparisons against your direct competitors when it comes to the latest stages of the journey. Indirect competitors a lot of times catch people off guard. An indirect competitor means that their company, you tend to be dismissive of them being a true competitive threat, because their company is a lot bigger than yours or a lot smaller than yours, or not as geographically relevant, meaning that they don't have a beachhead, they don't have a strong presence in the local markets where you do business. And your prospects have told you that that's the main deciding factor. So there's direct competitors, the obvious ones that torture you in the latest stages of the sales journey that are often make or break for whether you close a deal or not. There's the indirect competitors that most of the time you're not paying attention to enough because their companies are a lot bigger or a lot smaller than yours, or not operating in the same geographic markets as you are. Then there's a third category that virtually everyone overlooks: non-business model competitors. What's a non-business model competitor? This is someone or an entity or an organization, association, a channel partner, someone that's motivated to create fantastic educational content and fantastic educational events on a topic that's extraordinarily high interest to one of your most important buyer personas, and yet that company doesn't compete with you in your business model. So a perfect example would be, let's say you have a co-location data center operator business and you're selling to 2 primary verticals: healthcare and financial services. And because of that, because you've been listening to this podcast, because you've been attending Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, you've followed through and you've put out amazingly helpful educational content on your website in terms of videos, podcasts, webinars, downloadable premium content. You for sure have a fantastic page on your website under Who We Help, a page that's dedicated for what you do for healthcare and what you do for financial services. You've done all of those basics. However, you discover that in addition to someone learning from your webinar or your premium content for health tech executives in mid-market companies in your geographic region, you discover now that there's a couple of conference producers and there's a couple of media companies and a couple of associations that are not co-location operators, but are putting out, are publishing and promoting fantastic educational content and fantastic educational events experiences that are competing for attention with your marketers. And this is a really, really, really big deal, as so many companies have gone crazy with conference participation coming out of the early 2020s. And because of that, a lot of times they're not even asking the basic questions on, is this conference a good fit for our ideal client profile? Will someone from our team be in a position where we can educate and build trust? But so non-business model competitors are companies that don't do what you do, but have such great content, have such great educational events experiences that they are sucking the attention away from your funnel, away from your attention in a pretty profound way, that it's causing you to have to keep ratcheting up and leveling up on the value proposition and the scope of what you're doing to be able to match and exceed the level where they've set the new bar, where they've set the new standard. So standing out from the competition is a big deal, but it's become an even bigger deal because not only do we have direct, indirect, and non-business model competitors, your sales professionals now have competitors that are not even human. Now, this isn't saying that, wow, they hire such amazing people, it's like they're superhuman. It's like, no, you literally have competition against non-humans. As all of the generative AI companies are taking up massive amounts of space and fueling all this incredible growth in the data center industry, what most people are overlooking is your prospects and clients are now taking the same type of queries that they used to ask on their mobile device or on their desktop of Google, and they're putting those into ChatGPT or Copilot or Perplexity or one of those other apps. And the time savings of what they're getting back and the experience of what they're getting back is so ridiculously next level compared to what they were experiencing as recently as a couple of years ago on a traditional Google search, that their preferences have changed. And the experience that they're getting from these chat apps is so ridiculously good that they're now choosing to have conversations with these chat apps instead of having conversations with members of your sales team. Let that sink in for a moment. Your President's Club winners, your account executives, your sales developers, your business developers are now in competition with ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity. And it's a big, big deal. It's way beyond how do we get our company to be recommended in those questions. And that's a whole separate Q&A that we could do on what you can do to influence that, but a very real deer in the headlights moment, regardless of whether you sell to IT professionals or engineers or data center developers or ESG officers or whoever your target audience is. Nearly all are highly educated, highly skeptical, highly cynical, and allergic to spending time with sales professionals and marketing professionals, so much to the point that they would rather talk to their chat app. This is a massive problem. And it's also a massive opportunity for those that are able to reinvent themselves, to get out of the vendor box and be seen more like a trusted advisor, an expert, a teacher, a consultant, perhaps even a thought leader. This is competition, and it's very real competition. And I worry that there are thousands of sales professionals in this industry right now that are in such a state of euphoria, hanging around at all of these cult circus party-like environments that seem to happen a couple dozen times of the year, that they're completely missing that their prospects and clients don't want that anymore. And this is the reason why you end up with vendors selling to vendors, salespeople hanging out with other salespeople. And even the prospects that do show up, you're essentially trying to bribe them as opposed to getting what you need most from them, an opportunity to educate and build trust. The way we educate and build trust is we think about what it's going to take to radically transform you from being seen as a sales professional to becoming a core part of your prospects and clients' professional development and learning and development process. Because they might have zero interest anymore in having conversations with you until they're almost ready to buy, but they still need to learn. The question is, what's it going to take for you and your client-facing team members to show up and present this amazingly helpful, immersive, highly relevant educational events experience that motivates your ideal clients from your target accounts to want to not only attend these events and participate in these events, but over time bring more and more of their coworkers with them and even their boss. So you get to meet multiple members of the decision committee. So you get to indoctrinate and educate and build trust with multiple members of the decision committee when they're in their formative stages, when you can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the topics that are directly and indirectly related to digital infrastructure and finding the right data center operator. And for a lot of companies, this is a really big culture shift. There's hundreds of millions of dollars being spent globally on the status quo in this area. I often wonder if this was a little bit more widespread, if this would be the next Michael Lewis book or the next Michael Lewis movie. Because I don't know if you ever saw Moneyball or The Big Short. I see incredible parallels to what's going on with how these investments are being made with what's going on in The Big Short. So if you're a fan of Ryan Gosling or Steve Carell or Brad Pitt, and you want to entertaining dark comedy movie about the housing bubble that corrected and how everyone got it wrong except for a handful of people. I see a lot of parallels. And the irony is right now, what most people are very concerned about in the financial community is that too many of the AI-driven companies are too overvalued relative to their earnings multiples. And yeah, that's certainly a bubble that's out there. But what I'm much more concerned about is the layoffs of thousands of sales and marketing professionals and sales and marketing support professionals in this industry. That is inevitable if you don't get yourself out in front of this and position yourself in a way that your prospects and clients want to spend time with you and your coworkers. Because without that, your expertise is going to be commoditized. And your prospects and clients are going to completely bypass you with these self-service tools. Sure, there's still travel agents. Not everything is self-service. Sure, there's still some traditional limousine companies and traditional taxi cab operators that exist, but is it anywhere near what it was 10 or 20 years ago? Self-service? If self-service wasn't winning, you wouldn't see the marketplaces with all the big hyperscalers and all the big SaaS companies completely crushing and taking away from traditional channel partner ecosystems. Your buyers want what's best for them. They don't really care about what's best for you. I care about what's best for you. I'm here trying to help you save your career. I'm trying to help you keep yourself relevant. I'm trying to help buy you another 5, 10 plus years of relevance by transforming yourself to being seen more as a teacher, as a consultant, as a trusted advisor. I don't think the conference ecosystem cares about that. They're just a big venture funded, in some cases publicly, it's a big revenue generation engine. Does your employer care about where that revenue comes from long-term? I'd like to hope they do, but a lot of the big layoffs that are in response to AI trends, and it's not that politically correct to say what these AI trends are and what these motivations are, but I see the writing on the wall. We've been getting to this place for a lot of years in the making. And as traditional search becomes disrupted, as the social media platforms severely penalize, including external URLs in any of your posts, you are going to be increasingly squeezed by prospects and clients that are preferring self-service experiences and one of these 4 or 5 LLM platforms as opposed to talking with you. The best strategy, bar none, to keep you in the game and to keep you relevant is to build that strong professional brand where you're seen as the expert for a very specific slice of the data center ecosystem for your company, for your specific buyer persona, and for the 10 or 12 biggest goals and challenges that that buyer persona knows that they have and is articulated in their own words and providing highly, highly specific best practices and playbooks to help that individual thrive in their career. So the question is, are you in? Is this where you're going? Or are you going to bury your head in the sand and pretend that we're headed for a renaissance of fax machines and BlackBerries and printed phone books and printed trade publications? I've been in this space decades. I've been in the space a while. I began my IT career in my late teens, evangelizing Windows, or very early generation PCs and Windows for IBM academic information systems on campus with students, faculty, and staff. I've seen us go from PCs to client server to public cloud to infrastructure to where we're headed with generative AI. If you want to future-proof where you're headed next, this is the path forward. At some point, the perceived value of the bribes that are incredibly capital intensive to try to win people's attention when you're really not educating and building trust, it's going to come home to roost. There's only so much capital that can flow into these things before your CFOs and your boards start to pull the plug on those, or give your CRO or CCO, commercial officer, an ultimatum that something's got to give. Our unit economics are completely out of whack. Things like client acquisition costs, things like lifetime value. To position yourself as the ones that survive and thrive, educate and build trust. Get in early, get in often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so they no longer see you as just another account executive, just another sales developer, just another marketer, just another account manager, but instead see you as the be-all end-all expert when it comes to anything and everything that's top of mind with those big 5 or 10 goals and challenges for this very specific buyer persona in this geographic region of a company of roughly this size in this particular industry. And the better job you do with crushing that, the more you will insulate yourself from potentially being obsoleted by your prospects and clients bypassing you and going direct to a Gen AI app. We don't need to get to the point where we're predicting that your kids or grandkids are going to marry AI robots. We don't need to get anywhere near that. All we need is the slightest width of correction in the financial markets and capital starting to come out of this. And we want to get the target off your back. We want to make sure that it's incredibly clear to your prospects and clients that you provide exceptional value above and beyond what they can get in self-service apps. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center operator can stand out for the competition. Now, if you have an employer that gets that, if you have a boss that gets that and is fully supportive of that, you'll be in great shape. I know for a fact that especially in the US, there are a lot of data center operators, especially in mid-size and the largest data center operators, that literally forbid a huge percentage of their workforce from doing what's needed to make that a reality. So if you're comfortable with the reality that your employer, for their own selfish reasons, is screwing with your future, keep doing what you're doing. If you want to put yourself in a position where you're a lot more future-proof because you're working for a company that values you being seen as one of the top health tech co-location experts in the country, again, you get to decide where you spend your career. All I can do is point out what I observe overseeing thousands of sales and marketing professionals and product managers and account managers globally that work for data center operators. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center operator can stand out from the competition. Get out of the vendor box, transform yourself so you're no longer seen by traditional sales and marketing titles, and get to the point where your prospects and future clients see you as the be-all end-all expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location data center operators for very, very specific segments within the marketplace. Educate and build trust. That's the playbook going forward. And that brings us to our final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, which is, oh, by the way, before we do that, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So, final question. What are we going to be addressing today? How do we improve data center brand recognition? How do we improve data center brand recognition? That's a terrific question. And most of the time, when people start by talking about brand, the first thing they usually think about is aesthetics. So I want to dispel the notion that aesthetics are everything today. Aesthetics are important, but they're not going to be a differentiator anymore. They're just going to be something that if your aesthetics are atrocious or you're not consistent or something, it's no longer sufficient to get you qualified, but it is, if you're completely asleep on the wheel on that, it could get you disqualified, meaning that most of the branding and the aesthetic stuff have now become commoditized. It used to be 10 years ago that someone with a creative director title was the only one that was allowed to generate images for ebooks or social media or email marketing or digital ads. What's ended up happening is the tools, the design tools themselves have become so democratized and so commoditized over the past decade that you no longer need to be the one in your organization that has a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite to be the one that controls the brand. And sure, there is a brand guide and there's standards and everyone needs to be consistent. But the reality is, in the last couple of months, I've had mid-level sales leaders and divisional leaders from some of the largest data center infrastructure companies on the planet on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And within a couple week period, completely unprompted, one of the questions I usually ask guests is, so what are your favorite tools? What are your favorite software? What's your favorite apps that you and your team use that are so indispensable that if someone from your IT team or your finance team showed up and said, our SaaS, software as a service sprawl, has gotten so out of control, your department, your team is using 150 different apps. We got to get it down to 30. What are you fighting hard to hold on to? And what's super interesting is within a couple week period, two people in pretty similar companies in pretty different regions of the world both mentioned that their sales team loves Canva. And I'm not saying Canva is the answer on all of this, but the reality is when we're to the point where business developers, account executives, account managers are routinely using templates to dramatically accelerate the agility and the speed and the personalization and customization with design assets, we've gotten to the point where branding is a lot more decentralized as opposed to centralized. So that's important because what branding now means is it's no longer just about the hexadecimal colors and the logos and the fonts. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room, what it says about your team members in your company when you and your team members are not in the room. And given that we now live in a self-driven buyer's journey where you're locked out of the room for nearly all of the journey, it's a big challenge because essentially we now live in a world where 83% of the journey is happening with you excluded from being in the room. That's Gartner's latest data. We actually think it's even higher now. It's just they haven't revised it quite yet, meaning that by the time future clients are willing to take a meeting with someone from your sales team, they're almost ready to buy. So given that you're excluded from these early and middle stage meetings, and a lot of your brand perception exists based on conversations that the marketplace has about your team members and your brand in rooms that you're not allowed to attend, what do? Well, it just so turns out that a lot of these conversations about how the marketplace talks about your brand are massively influenced by content and educational events experiences, by thought leadership content and educational events experiences. Because even though a huge percentage of your addressable market, your ideal clients, your prioritized buyer personas, despise spending time with sales and marketing folks. They're more sales allergic, marketing allergic than they've ever been. There's a trust crisis confidence of magnitude we've never seen. Even though all of those things exist and you're locked out for the first 83%, your core prioritized buyer personas still need to learn valuable skills and best practices and playbooks to help them do their job better. So what that means is if we want to be able to earn our way in early and often, to have surface area coverage in as many of those 28 touch points as possible, with as many stakeholders on the decision committee as possible, our content and our educational events experiences are now a proxy, are now a replacement for what used to happen in one-on-one conversations as recently as 10 years ago. So in this world where we don't have a choice because we know 83% is going to go to 90% and 95% and then 100%. Part of the data center ecosystem is already moved to 100%. Otherwise, we wouldn't see, like in public cloud, for example, how many people buy self-service on marketplaces? A huge, huge percentage. On like bare metal hosting, how many people do you know that buy self-service and sign up and self-onboard? Huge. The handwriting is on the wall already with a lot of these preferences. So the question is, how do we get you in there early enough to make a big impact so that you're able to educate and build trust and shape that brand perception that's heavily formulated in the first 83% and locked in and finalized in that final 17%? We need to get you in to be part of their professional development and their learning and development process. What this means is being exceptionally close to your prospects and future clients to understand exactly who they are at the account level, geographically where they're located, how big or small their companies are, what industries they tend to be located in, and then the people within those accounts, the prioritized buyer personas. What are their 5 or 6 big goals that they're working on individually, as a team, as a company? And we need to know those goals, not in what you think those goals are, but what their words actually are that articulate those in their exact words. If we guess, there's a really good chance we're going to guess wrong. And when we guess wrong, we don't resonate. We want to resonate. We need their exact words, the consensus on their exact words. And we can't just think about the goals that drive their job description and drive their objectives and key results, their OKRs. We need to also understand what they're struggling with, their biggest challenges, what's driving them nuts. And again, we can't guess on these. We need the consensus on their own words. Goals and challenges, 10 or 12 big goals, topics, challenges that they're top of mind with for each of those buyer personas. If we talk to CFOs like they're CTOs, not going to be effective. If we talk to like technology executives, if they're chief sales officers, not going to be effective. They care about different things. Sure, there's a small sliver of overlap. Otherwise, conference producers would never be able to have a general session. But at the end of the day, the reason there's tracks and breakout sessions is because people care about what they care about, what's relevant for their particular job function. And they don't care that much about other job functions and their coworkers. First and foremost, they're worried about their promotion. They're worried about keeping their own job. Yeah, in a perfect world, no one likes to see their coworkers have threats to their promotion or threats to their continuous employment, but they need to concentrate on what's top of mind for them. So segmenting, personalizing that education and that trust building is incredibly important. Don't be lazy. So with that in mind, your website for sure needs a separate page for each of your prioritized buyer personas. It needs a separate lead generation offer for each of your buyer personas. It needs a separate email marketing strategy for each of your most important buyer personas. And it needs a separate events strategy for each of your prioritized buyer personas. And once you've decided on an event strategy that's going to be driven by those 10 or 12 topics, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what your split should be between your owned events versus your paid events. Right now, by default, in the data center industry, people take 90% of their events budget and they throw it over the wall to paid events and they keep their fingers crossed. Why? Because that's what they think is the safe option. The reality is paid events, whether you're talking about attending events, exhibiting at events, or speaking at events, is very unlikely to have 100% ICP match, ideal client profile match. In other words, it's extraordinarily unusual for a conference producer media kit to be perfectly aligned with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas. If it is, fantastic. Keep doing that conference and work as hard as possible to be in that top 3% of attendees that gets to educate and build trust. If there's a mismatch, look at the degree of mismatch. A little bit of mismatch, fine. Half mismatch, probably not too bad. If only a small slice of the people at that event line up with your ideal client profile, I can tell you without a doubt that budget needs to be redirected into your own events, your own webinars, your own breakfast seminars, your own lunch and learns. Because you know what happens when you have your own events? You get a 100% match, or pretty close to 100% match. You get to decide who gets invited. You get to decide the topics. You get to decide the time of the day of the week. You get to decide how much lead time there is. You get to decide who speaks and for how many minutes they get to speak. All of those are 100% within your control. And because of that, you don't need huge numbers. If your conference room or your classroom seats 15 or 20 people, and you have a monthly breakfast seminar series on the first Wednesday of the month for your primary buyer persona, 90 minutes of education and trust building, game-changing impact on those 15, 18, 19, 20 people that are coming every week, every month from those companies. And over time, what you'll hopefully start to notice is you start to see bigger and bigger clusters from your target accounts, where by month 2, by month 3, by month 4, you get 2, 3, 4 people coming together from the same company. What that means is you're proactively driving alignment in the formative stages of the buyer's journey, where you can really have a huge, huge impact on the criteria that they use in your category. Of course, record all of these, record your webinars, repurpose, make it available for all the people that wanted to attend that couldn't attend. This is what it means to build a brand in today's sales-averse, sales-allergic, self-driven buyer's journey, where you're literally competing for attention against ChatGPT and Copilot, Claude, Perplexity, and Gemini. So your expertise, your consulting, your teaching, your thought leadership needs to be better than they're getting from the self-service experience, which means hyper relevance is incredibly important. Getting you out of the vendor box is incredibly important. In a self-service world where you're locked out of the first 83% of the journey, the only way left for you to earn your way in early and often is by educating and building trust, transforming yourself from being seen as a revenue team to being seen as an extension of your prospects and clients' professional development and learning development. This is the new foot in the door. It's changing the nature of how we hire. It's changing the nature of how we upskill, how we reskill, how we do territory assignments, how we do named account assignments in a very, very profound way. If you're serious about improving your data center brand recognition, don't bet your brand in the hands of intermediaries. There's way too much at stake. We don't want a loss of fidelity. We don't want a conflict of interest. We need to take our brand directly to where it matters most, our ideal clients and our prioritized buyer personas. The better job you can do with prioritizing that, the more you will protect your company's brand, your team's brand, and your individual's brand. The more you bury your head in the sand and try to sell and market as if you're expecting a renaissance of printed phone books and BlackBerries and fax modems, I don't know what to tell you, except that the buyer data, the buyer preferences are very, very rapidly shifting towards self-service. To get you back in there, to stay relevant, to extend your value so that your prospects and clients want to spend time with you, the playbook is super, super clear. It's just that I've been running events like this for nearly all of my career, going back more than 25 years at this point. And there's nothing rocket science about this. It's just that it's gone from being a nice to have to being pretty much one of the only ways left that gets the human part to still be highly valued, to still be highly relevant, to educate and build trust. And we want to be hyper specific about who they are, what they care about. Being as client-centric as possible is incredibly important for improving our data center brand recognition in the marketplace, in an industry, in an ecosystem that increasingly very, very strongly favors the self-driven journey and severely penalizes those companies that are not present in that first 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing. I want to make sure that you, your team, and your company really, really stack the decks in your favor to improve your data center brand recognition in this marketplace, not just for what's going to happen in the future, but for what has actually already happened. You know, many people that are saying, I don't know about this ChatGPT Copilot thing. I miss the days when I can go look for 10 blue links. That was so much more fun. Know anyone that's doing that? I don't. The handwriting is on the wall. Do you know anyone that said, you know what? YouTube makes it too easy. Is there a library that I can drive to and like a DVD or VHS that I can sign out for a couple of weeks and go watch that at some point a couple of weeks from now? Because I I don't want to get the answer right now. I'm okay if I get the answer in like 2 weeks and I have to spend 3 hours to get the answer that I could get in 30 seconds. It's not going backwards. We know where it's headed. The question is, are you realistic about that? Is your team being realistic about it? Is your boss being realistic about it? Is your company being realistic about it? If you are serious about improving your data center brand recognition in a hyper-competitive, always-on 7x24, 365 marketplace where you're literally competing for attention with people all over the planet, this is the playbook. How much more plain I can make it. Educate and build trust. Get in there early, get in there often, transform yourself from being seen as a vendor to being seen as the definitive go-to expert on anything and everything having to do with direct and indirectly related to your category of expertise. That's the key with all of this. And that's what I'd be focusing on for improving your data center brand recognition. That's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Again, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think that we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you watch, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter so you can get notified each week in your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you would like to be sure to mention in the note with the invitation that you watch Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A and that you're a fan of the show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. So we're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. We wish you and your team tremendous success in growing your impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact throughout the global data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure ecosystem. Take care now and have a great week.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.